Welcome to devMode FM, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Marion Newlevant here in Portland, Oregon.
I'm Michael Rogg coming at you from Houston, Texas.
Jonathan Melville in Atlanta, Georgia.
And joining us today is Mark Huot. Mark, welcome aboard.
Hi, thanks everyone.
And we are going to be discussing GraphQL, and then more specifically, Mark's plugin called CraftQL, which is used for making that available to Craft CMS 3. So let's start talking about it. I think a lot of people that are tuning in have probably heard of GraphQL. Hopefully they've heard of CraftQL too. And, you know, maybe they've kind of seen people talking about it and been like, oh, you know, that kind of sounds cool. But may or may not have done anything with it. So if you were at, a dinner party and someone miraculously came up to you and said, hey, Mark, what the heck is GraphQL? What would you tell them?
So first off, that sounds like a good dinner party. That's absolutely something I would go to. But what is GraphQL? I would say there's so many benefits to GraphQL, and there's so many changes from something like a traditional REST endpoint to it. But I would say the thing that GraphQL is it allows you to make documented requests to an endpoint and get back an expected return, I guess. It get back a documented return.
So GraphQL is a way to talk to an external data source, right? Mm-hmm. Like an example that I think is used a lot is there's a database called Goodreads, which is a database of books, right? So let's say that you had a website and you wanted to be able to search through the Goodreads data. You might use an API. In the past, you might have used an API like REST, where you can query some external data source and get a result back. I know REST can do more than that as well, but just in our example. And then in an analogous way, you can use GraphQL to then go out over the wire and grab data from somewhere and bring it back into your web page. Is that about right?
Yeah, I'd say definitely.
So why should I care about GraphQL? There's already this awesome thing called REST. It defines an API. I can use that to talk to other things. Why would I care about GraphQL?
So, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I think REST can do everything you need it to do. You know, REST powers so many APIs. It powers so many websites out there. It powers millions of applications out there. So I don't know that GraphQL can kind of inherently do anything that REST can't do. It's just a different way to do those things. And I think what GraphQL adds that REST has but no one uses, or REST has but no one documents, or REST has but it's confusing, is GraphQL has that type system. It has that documented type system.
What does that mean?
So what that means is that when you write a query to a GraphQL endpoint, you're going to say, I want a book and I want it by this author. And you know that you have to type in the author's ID, or you know that you have to type in the author's name, or you know that you have to type in a relationship that shows the author by name and first name and last name. So you know when you're typing something into GraphQL that this is exactly what you have to type in, because the query won't validate and it won't actually send.
Right.
If you're using a system like GraphQL, you can't actually send it without having a valid query go across the wire. And I think that's a
Sorry, whereas with a lot of REST APIs, I mean, again, you're saying that you can do it, but no one does. In my experience, I've never run into anyone doing it. Usually you send the query out, and if there's something wrong, it'll return some kind of an error code, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you can get into these ideological arguments over it. Like REST does it. And like if you have a REST API that you can add and remove fields in your return from, and you have a REST API that you can You can validate before it sends. You have a REST API that you can control. You can do all of these things through REST, but with GraphQL, it's documented, and there's one way to do it, and only one way to do it. And I think that's a powerful thing that REST doesn't have.
I think that's a really crucial subtlety, because looking at like GraphQL, graph is part one, and query language is part two, and that I think is the definition of where GraphQL provides value over just your standard REST. The graph bit means that within this system, the system has some knowledge of the schema relationships between different types of things that are represented, and the query language part means that there is this standard, well-documented way that you can send and receive different types of data and make different queries, right? Because if you go back to REST literally stands for representational state transfer, and you have some resources and some different verbs that you can do to them. And anytime that you do some verb to some resource, you are dealing with the entire resource, and from the outside, you are fully relying on the implementation for each client and for each endpoint, to sort of define what things are. And so you can't deal with only part of a resource, and you can't deal with more than one resource. And there's really no way to like run an intelligent looking query against a resource like you would, with a database. And so then along comes GraphQL and says, all right, well, we're still, working with some remote data source. We're still doing it over HTTP, but now we've added, some knowledge that items have about each other and that the system has about types of items. And now we've added a query language, so you can work with pieces of resources, or you can work with multiple resources, and you can query them in lots of different ways instead of just give me this resource or put this resource here.
Yeah. And first of all, one of my big problems with REST, and it has to do with anything, I hate it when people come up with acronyms, and one of the letters in there, they just are like, it's the first two letters of representational. There's no E in REST, okay? It should be the RST framework. It's a terrible lack of creativity. They could have come up with some gratuitous E in the middle that would have made it work out for me, and it would have been fine.
Yes, but RST already stood for other things.
Whatever.
So they couldn't do it.
Well, that's what I'm saying. They could have come up with just some E word to put in the middle, like representational enterprise state transfer. Something. Like, please, people, like a little bit of effort.
Entity would have been fine.
Or entity, yeah, sure. But if Mark, I'm going to kind of answer my own question that I asked you earlier. If someone comes up to you at a cocktail party and says, "What is GraphQL?" My kind of answer would be it's kind of like an unholy union between JSON and SQL, right? Because does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's really good. And it's weird because the query language looks so much like JSON, but it's not. But right. You want it to be JSON. So yeah, I think that's a really good description.
So why isn't it JSON?
Because of the type system. Because JSON doesn't have types, so
right.
You can't represent a query in JSON because it doesn't have types. So you get like this JSON response back, and you know that you're going to get a string here. You know that you're going to get an author here, and the actual response isn't typed. Only the input is the actual typed language or type data.
Right. So it just does the type checking on the input. Right.
Yeah, and you're sure that the response is going to come back the type you expect, but because JSON doesn't have types, it's not actually that way. But you know that it's going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Now
the way that GraphQL hawks itself, by the way, is a query language for your API.
Right.
And that's probably how I would answer the question at the cocktail party. What is GraphQL? Well, it's a standard packagized query language.
Right, because if we're all used to MySQL on some level or another, where you can query, a particular table and you can ask for just particular columns from that table in a similar way, which REST, to my knowledge, doesn't, or maybe can if you kind of add additional segments onto it. But you, using GraphQL, can say, I just want these pieces. Like, I know that the book is this huge data blob, but all I really care about is the author. Just give me the author back. That's all I want back. And in a similar way, if you're using Craft CMS, Craft 3, using the element queries, you can say, give me this entry, but I only care about this field, right? And that's kind of what GraphQL is letting you do, right? It's saying, this is all the data. I know there's tons of data out there, but I only care about this, and that's what makes it lightweight, right, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the argument that you'll see in all like the Hacker News threads about GraphQL, is that we can do this in REST. You just have to add this query parameter to your REST endpoint, and it will only return these 3 fields.
Right.
And yeah, you can add this query parameter to that API and do it, or you can add this other query parameter to the GitHub API and do it, or Goodreads API. But it's always different, and it's always just slightly different enough to make it kind of hair-pullingly.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like saying you can clean your floor with a toothbrush, and yes, you can, but it's a whole lot easier if you've got the appropriate tool for the job.
So, Andrew, you linked the other day on Twitter to a really interesting video about the Goodreads API and converting it over to a to a GraphQL API. And what I thought was interesting is they actually, in that video, they just fronted the REST API with a GraphQL API. And one thing that's kind of interesting is GraphQL kind of acts as a really nice middleware to your backend API. So internally, like for your internal application, you may use REST for everything. You may have, a messaging queue that's a REST API communicating with, your workers or something like that. And that works great between those two systems. But when you expose it out to the public, you may write a GraphQL API. That's what actually gets exposed to the public. That's kind of your documented API that the end users can use. I think that's an interesting niche that GraphQL could solve as well, as kind of a public layer on top of REST. And
that is something that we're actually actively pursuing in a project that I'm working on. It's still in the kind of R&D phase, but they're looking at implementing a whole lot of back-end systems and with a REST API that gives access to it. And we're looking at implementing a GraphQL layer on top of that then talks to it, because the capabilities that they need for the whole back-end system to work are pretty big. But what we want to be able to do on the front end in order to get certain types of information out is a lot more lightweight, and we don't want all of that cruft. So we really will be using GraphQL as kind of a transitory API, if you will. So yeah, I mean, we're looking at doing exactly that with it. So it should be kind of interesting. So in order for this to work, I assume there has to be some kind of a GraphQL server sitting somewhere, right? Yeah.
Just one more point though before we move on, because I think it's important. I think the type system and all the stuff about GraphQL is fantastic, and I kind of fell into the benefits of all of those things. But what initially made me look at GraphQL like in depth is when GitHub updated their API to use GraphQL, because one of the pain points I always have when using the GitHub API is I want to show a user a list of their repositories. And that's relatively easy to do, except for the fact that you first have to get the user details, to get the organizations they're part of, to get the repos that they're a part of the organization. You can't just make one query to get all of a user's repos. You have to go through the user to the organizations, to the repos of the organization. And if you want to get details about the organization, then you have to make an individual request for each repo to get, the star count or something like that.
And these are multiple chained queries that any one of them you have to handle failed states and all sorts of horrible things like that.
And you end up with this miserable, and if you're doing it in Node, you end up with this miserable promise chain of it's just promise after promise. So
right, you're looking at your editor, and there's nothing but promises.
That's exactly what it is.
Oh God.
And so I was like, oh man, GraphQL solves this, and this is fantastic. I can make one request, and I can say I want user me, and then in curly braces, I also want to get repos, and inside repos, I want to get organizations, or you can kind of nest those things in one. So to go back to your dinner party question, I think kind of the easiest benefit to see, I think, from outside looking in, or just from a cursory glance, is you can take 5 requests and make it 1 request with GraphQL. I think that's a really big selling point of GraphQL as a kind of over the wire mechanism. At the end, internal to GitHub, they're still making the same requests. They're still making the same queries. They're hitting the same databases. Everything's the same, but you only have to make one request as a consumer.
Yeah, which is really nice on the front end. And then I think the other kind of big selling point of it is what we've already discussed, is that you're going to get back only the stuff that you asked for. Which,
and I think, you mentioned SQL like earlier, and I think that's actually a decent analogy, right? Because if I'm running, some MariaDB database on my server, I could hit the hard drive and open the file that represents each record and see the raw data for the record in its entirety. And I think most of the time, like, that's what REST feels like to me. It's like, pull me the current state of some resource. But obviously working with my database that way would be beyond asinine, right? And that's why we have the query language, so that I can do these like filters and joins, and so that I can, in an abstract sense, rely on the system to take care of some optimizations for me. And in terms of dev experience, I can, alias names and pull related things and query my data beyond just, looking at its state. So I think the SQL analogy is actually kind of helpful.
Well, it's SQL in an unholy union with JSON, right? We can't leave out the unholy union part.
Okay.
All right. So
or maybe it's holy. Maybe it's holy.
It could be holy. Who knows? Yeah. I mean, it could be. It could be fantastic.
What I guess my point is, we sort of skipped all the things that it can do, and I want to make sure that we like hawk what it is,
right?
Which is, it's a query language, and just like any other system that has a query language, the point of it is so that you can be intelligent about the way that you talk to your data, rather than just working with it, resource by resource in a raw entire format.
Right, or doing multiple chained requests like Mark was talking about before.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Right? Like who would do that? Who would write the SQL query to find the users, and then write another SQL query to find their passwords or whatever? You want that query language so that you can pick what you get back and join it to other resources.
Right. Let me say up front what I want, and then give me back just what I asked for. Right? I mean, that's kind of what it's doing. So let's talk about, just real quick, the origins of GraphQL. So this came from Facebook, right?
Yeah, it came from Facebook, came out of the React. Well, I guess it kind of came out of the React kind of Facebook movement. Everything's on the front end JavaScript side of things. And it came out as a spec. So I could be misremembering the history here, and I hate to get that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it came out as a spec first. And it came out with a Node.js implementation, like an example implementation in Node.js when the spec came out. And it didn't come out as and I think a lot of people, when it came out, they were like, oh, this is a new MySQL, or this is a new Node.js database. The assumption was, oh, this is a brand new database system. I'm going to install it, and I'm going to run this, and I'm going to put data into it and get data out of it.
Right.
And it kind of, as it was gaining popularity and people were realizing what it truly is, it's not that. It's a layer that sits on top of REST, or it's a layer that sits on top of things. And the spec is very clear that it's not a database. It's not a persistent storage.
Right.
It's something else implements the persistent storage, whether that's Node.js, or in Craft's case, in GraphQL's case, it's Craft, but something else implements the persistent storage. Michael brought it up. All it is it's a query language for your API. So the spec is really clear that it's not that. It's not anything else than that query language, than that kind of transport mechanism.
But that's what makes it awesome.
Came out of Facebook.
That's what makes it awesome, though, right? Because then you've got your GraphQL API. You can, in theory, swap out the backend to be whatever the hell you want it to be, right? It could be MySQL, it could be MongoDB, it could be whatever you want it to be, and you already have this kind of defined interface, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. Because then, if on the back end you realize that you should be using a different kind of technology, you can swap it out. All you have to make sure is that it responds to that GraphQL API, and the front end stuff is still going to work, right? Yeah. So I think that's a really kind of powerful piece of it. But it's interesting to me to think about where it came out of. So we got some pretty, I mean, we're not going to go into it, but we got some horrible things about Facebook in the news currently. But let's talk about some of the good stuff about Facebook, which is that, React came out of it. And also now GraphQL came out of it. But think about why both of those things came out from Facebook, and look at the problems that they're trying to solve on their web pages, where they've just got tons of information and people and events, and they're trying to interconnect all of them. And that's probably where GraphQL came from, is they wanted a lightweight way to query all this stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, trivia, Mark, was Falcor before GraphQL?
Before, yeah.
Okay. So actually, we should throw some love at Netflix, because Netflix sort of started the we need a better way to fetch data from our API push, and that was Falcor, right? Because they realized that they were implementing this query language into their REST API once per client per resource type, and that was stupid. And so they, wanted some really consistent spec for accessing their data in a smart way across all of their clients, and that became Falcor. And then I think GraphQL was kind of the spiritual successor to that, which added stuff like attribute queries and
yeah.
I don't remember exactly the history, but I want to say I heard it from Netflix first.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I remember it. I think I remember being excited about Falcor, and then GraphQL kind of taking all of that away from them. And it probably was concurrently. Like, they're probably both working on the same problem at the same time. But
right.
Yeah, I definitely remember
because Falcor was fetch only, and it had no notion of schema.
Right.
And then GraphQL was like, okay, that's cool. We'll add a little bit of learning curve and get all this schema knowledge out of it. So probably around the same time. But both huge data sets with really broad, complicated schemas,
Right.
and a need to get the data out in a really standardized way across lots and lots and lots of different clients, and not have to re-implement it and redocument it.
And the reason why GraphQL won is Facebook profiled everybody and presented them information on GraphQL, right?
As I recall, they worked with the Russians on that.
All right, but so let's be serious and get back to what we're talking about here. So in order for this to work, just like in order for a traditional CMS to work, there has to be a database running on a server somewhere. In order for GraphQL or REST, for that matter, to work, there has to be a server somewhere that is providing this information, right?
Yeah. So you have, like, if we go back to the Goodreads example from a while back, whether it's a REST API or just actual code, like you're implementing the code directly, there's some persistent storage that stores the authors, that stores the books, that stores the descriptions about the books, and then the web service that you're interacting, when you make the request to a web server, the web server is serving GraphQL. And it's that web server's responsibility to go to the persistent storage and do whatever it needs to do to get the database, to get that information back to you. But yeah, at the end of the day, I think you still need that data somewhere. And GraphQL sits between you and that data, giving you a documented query language to get at it.
Right. And the cool thing is, like we said before, let's say we're using Craft CMS, right? We're using Craft 3, and we're installing your awesome GraphQL plugin. And we'll talk about that more in depth later. But we are then essentially turning our Craft website into a GraphQL server, right? Mm-hmm. And then on the front end, via JavaScript, presumably, or potentially via PHP on the back end, whatever, we are then talking to ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And we're saying, give me this, give me that, whatever. The cool thing about that is, let's say that we're doing software as a service and it takes off, and we decide that we really want to make an iOS app, right? Well, then our iOS app can still talk to our Craft server, get all the same data that the website is getting, and pull that all in, because we've got a neutral API where all this stuff is. And then at some point down the road, we're mentioned on some big talk show, and we just explode, and we're ready to do our IPO. We can then take the GraphQL API that was running on Craft, and we can run it on a dedicated cluster, right? And our front end is never going to be the wiser, right? And that's kind of the power of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so like always, I think you could do all that with REST too, but I do think that there's definitely benefits to doing it in GraphQL because it's meant to be that layer. Most of the time when you're writing REST, you write it as this is I think it was like Michael said, this is my database and REST is how I interact with my database. But GraphQL is intentionally meant to be a middleware or something between you and the data. So you're not writing it with the same, in my opinion, you're not writing it with the same kind of preconceived notions as you would REST. So I think that's a really good example of how GraphQL could benefit you there, that you could swap out whatever's underneath or behind GraphQL because it's not usually as tied as closely to your persistent store.
Right.
Yeah, I think it shifts the implementation a little bit, right? Like if I have some data source, maybe it's Craft CMS, and I want to write an API, if I'm just using vanilla REST, then the thing that I end up implementing is the endpoints, the controller endpoints that REST requests talk to. And so I'm writing all of this logic that sort of translates some request from the outside world into logic that is specific to my domain. So the thing that I'm implementing is REST endpoints. Whereas with GraphQL, the thing that I'm implementing isn't specific endpoints so much as it is what you would call the GraphQL server, which is sort of drawing the bridge between the schema of my domain and the graph query language so that I can write GraphQL queries against my data in a generalized way. And so you're still implementing some logic to bridge, some requests from the outside world to my domain schema. But when you're doing it with GraphQL, you're doing it in a much more generalized way, rather than just writing each specific endpoint for each specific verb. You're just teaching GraphQL what my data looks like and how to, query it so that it can serve as that generalized, standardized middleman.
Yeah. Now, as I'm listening to us talk, I'm kind of having an out-of-body experience, and I'm taking myself out of the kind of nerd fest that we're having here and thinking about someone who's listening and saying, well, I primarily make websites using Craft or other CMSs. I'm probably not going to be implementing my own API. Like, why should I care about this? And I'll answer that first, but I'd be curious to hear if anyone else had any input on this. I think a reason why you might be interested in it, even if you're not doing anything where your website is necessarily providing data that needs to be consumed by something, is that there's a lot of momentum behind GraphQL, and I think it's very possible that a lot of the services that you might end up wanting to hook up to might very well be, transitioning to being a GraphQL API at some point down the road, like, Algolia for search or any number of other third-party APIs that you might be using. So, Marion, do you have you're hearing us talk about all this stuff? You're looking at us disapprovingly. Do you have anything you want to add here?
I'm not disapproving. I think what we've been, if I were to summarize, not at the dinner party, but in the elevator, that what we've been saying is that GraphQL is an API, which is to say it's an interface, and it's a sort of friendlier interface, more generic interface than REST, which is, it's like this REST interface, that REST interface, the other REST interface, each one very specific for what you're trying to do.
Right.
So all the advantages of having a good interface. And I think that, going forward, or why you would want to know about this, it's, anytime you're designing an interface of your own, and anytime you're doing anything that anybody is interacting with, you're designing an interface and being more aware of what makes a good interface, having more examples of good interfaces is just going to be a useful thing.
Yeah, that's very true. Hey, Jonathan, you've been sitting over there silently, looking disapprovingly as well, as I can see.
Sulking
your
in the other corner.
countenance, sulking in that brick background back there. What do
No,
you think? What do you think about all this craziness?
I've just been catching up on my rest. Actually, I have a 4-month-old, so I'm just kind of napping in between the conversation. But no, I mean, I think going back to this idea that, if you're saying, well, all I do is I build websites, I'm not like exposing an API that somebody's going to consume or whatever.
Right.
I mean, more and more, we're seeing like use cases for when you actually do need to talk to yourself.
Right.
To have this API. Maybe you're getting data from Vue, or maybe you have a type ahead search, like search suggest or something. So you want to get back data that you can use to populate search suggestions or whatever. So, I mean, in the past, I guess we would have used like maybe the Elements API or something like that.
Right.
But then again, you're stuck wading through this massive like object of data where you really only need, the data that you actually want. So I'll admit I haven't played with GraphQL, but it sounds really fascinating.
And I think the other kind of use case for that user who's not writing the API themselves is, for services like Netlify, for services like GitHub Pages, where you're deploying in a static environment where you're not running the service yourself. I have a project going out soon that actually is a Craft CMS site, and it's on a DigitalOcean droplet, and it's a relatively small droplet because we're launching the front end on Netlify.
Right.
So we're launching a static front end that's communicating with the back end over GraphQL, and it works out pretty well in that case. But it's going to be similar for other services too. You have a static front end, and you just need to pull in sidebar content, or you just need to pull in comments, or there's small things like that you want to pull into a static environment. I think that's another good place that we'll see move towards GraphQL.
And that's a big thing that I do. Like pretty much every website that I do these days is a static cache website in one form or another. And some of them are certainly going to be what you're talking about, where they're just deployed to Netlify, and they just communicate with a headless craft to get the information that they need to render. And the JAMstack thing, I mean, it's a real thing. It may not be the solution for every website out there, but you can do some really, really cool stuff with either Vue or React on the front end, and then have that kind of divorced from the content and talking to a Craft CMS instance on the back end. And that can be a really powerful thing, because like you said, then you have a server that effectively all job is to do is to manage the content, and the front end can be served up as static pages that are on a worldwide distributed CDN, and they just load, right?
I love how we were going to graduate from our nerd fest and then ended up talking about React and Vue and static caching and Jam.
Well, I'm bringing it full circle, okay?
I think the theme that everybody's getting at is you don't necessarily have to be writing or running your own GraphQL server in order to be interested in GraphQL. Like,
you're going to be consuming it.
If this is the direction that things are going, then your Instagram feed and your, whatever little widget that you want to put on your little website, you may be consuming somebody else's GraphQL service. So, if it's Craft, someone like Mark has already done the work of writing the GraphQL server for Craft, and all you have to do is consume it, or Netflix or GitHub or Instagram or whatever, right? And so you are interested in GraphQL not because you want to write a server of your own, but because you appreciate the ease and benefits and performance that will come from just using other people's services.
Yeah, and the thing I really like about the direction that the web is going is that instead of everyone's little custom homebrew JavaScript that manages pages, we're actually getting some kind of de facto standards in Vue and React or whatever, where if someone is approaching a project, if they understand Vue or React, they can know how all this stuff works. And in a similar way, with GraphQL, instead of someone's kind of homebrew way of talking to one service or another, there's a standard way that this stuff is kind of defined and communicated, and that knowledge is something that will carry you from one project to another. But let's transition to talking about the kind of craft side of things, because while this podcast isn't exclusively about craft, I mean, we all use it in one capacity or another. If I am writing something in Craft CMS today, and I want to kind of expose that functionality to the world, I have two options without any kind of third-party stuff added. One is I write a custom plugin or controller, and I have controller actions that can then be pinged and can return data and can do stuff. The other option is we can use the first-party plugin for Craft, which is the Element API, where it's this kind of custom thing where we can define various endpoints and then return data from them. But they're really, other than those two solutions, I mean, that's really the only way to use Craft headless out of the box, right? So, Michael, you're making a strange face. Is it because you don't have your computer science credentials with you?
I do have my computer science credentials.
What are they today?
Actually, today it's just Pachod's bitters in Topo Chico.
My God, you're fancy. I was just going to say you're downing vodka, but I guess not.
No, man, it's bitters and topo. We're taking it easy today because I got to go work out right after this.
All right.
No, I mean, there's lots of different ways to run Craft headless, right? You can run, write your own JSON in a template. You can write your own JSON from a controller method that you write in a plugin. You can do stuff with RSS feeds. There's lots of different ways to run Craft headless.
Well, I'm talking about like an API-ish thing.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, exactly. Like I've written my own API. I've written my own.
You wrote an API as an RSS feed?
Absolutely.
What is wrong with you?
I mean, I've run it out of templates before.
It depends. Yeah. Like when we do like Alexa skills and Google Assistant skills, that's all. It's feeds. It's feeds and XML, and there's probably some like little. Like stateless function server, like a Lambda or something that just takes an Alexa request and sends it to my template, and my template gives it some really derpy, simple XML. But I think the difference between all of these things grouped together, your XML in a template, your JSON in a plugin, your Element API, is that you are defining each endpoint specifically per data, per client. And the greener grass on the other side of the sunrise is I just drop in Mark's plugin, and all of a sudden I can just write these standardized queries against my data. I could implement that myself lots of different ways, but it's nice to have this really generalized standard, and I don't have to.
Yeah, why would you want to? That would be a lot of work. I mean, I think Mark can attest to the amount of work that involves. And yeah, I mean, I never really thought of XML feeds as an API, but I guess they could be. I definitely have done the, in a template thing. And I think that makes sense because if you're already using Twig to render stuff, you can return JSON and, kind of do whatever you want to do with it. But
anyone who has ever tried to return JSON from Twig is like having a visceral, cringy reaction right now.
Yeah. I mean, let's put it this way. There's lots of stuff you could do, and there's tons. I mean, I see it every day where whether it's on Stack Exchange or in Slack where someone is doing something in Twig that I'm just like, oh, man, like, why? Like, I know you can, but should you really?
When you watch the YouTube of the guy who's trying to go to space in a steam rocket to prove that the Earth is flat,
right?
Like that's how I feel about implementing JSON in a template. And granted, that was my past self, right? So I'm digging on my past self as much as I would dig on anybody who's doing it now. But God help you if that's what you're.
But again, as we've said many times, if you don't look back at your past self and think, "My God, I'm an idiot," you're not learning enough, right? So, Mark, let's talk about how to do it right from the perspective of we have some kind of data that we want to expose. Maybe we're using Craft headless, or if we're not using it headless, there's just some data on the back end that we want to expose. And we're on board. We think that GraphQL sounds awesome. What do we do now? How do we make this happen? How do we blast off from that rocket ship on a lawn chair into space?
So the example I use usually is if you have a list of news or a list of press releases or some list of a channel in Craft lingo, and you want to load more button at the bottom. So they click load, instead of going to page 2, you just want to load more. So that to me is a good use case for something like a REST endpoint or a GraphQL endpoint, because you're going to use JavaScript, you're going to use jQuery, you're going to use React, you're going to use something to fetch that data and pull it back. And I think where GraphQL can come in here is you can make that request to the endpoint and kind of move on with your day. Where GraphQL
first,
now,
I have to install a plugin.
Yeah, so where GraphQL, the plugin, comes into play here is you install GraphQL plugin through the plugin store. It gets installed, you enable it, and what it does out of the box is it just takes your entire Craft schema and it turns it into a GraphQL or a GraphQL schema.
So it just automatically makes an API for everything.
It does, and you have to thank the Pixel and Tonic team for that, because they used the right kind of naming scheme to kind of make everything work really nicely in that way, because Craft is architected well enough that it makes all of this work.
There have been so many times that I've been in there, coding stuff for Craft, and I have just looked up to the sky and praised Brandon's OCD and said, thank you.
Thank you for this. Thank you for that. Absolutely. And it's like little things, like using camel casing works perfectly with GraphQL. And like it's like little stuff like that. But as an example, to use the old example, if you have something called news and the handle for news is NEWS lowercase, then in GraphQL, you can say, give me all news. And you just type in news, NEWS lowercase, and it gives you back all of your entries in news. And you can say, I want the IDs or the titles or the custom fields. And that's where you can start to use GraphQL and specify what everything needs. But yeah, it really is just turn on the plugin and interact with Craft through GraphQL instead of...
now, the first thing that I think of when I hear this is, holy crap, security nightmare. How do I auth and make sure people aren't just, being able to dump my data out via GraphQL?
So what my goal was with GraphQL was to re-implement craft.entries as much as I could through GraphQL. So everything craft.entries, my goal is anything craft.entries can do, GraphQL can do. And if craft.entries can't do it, then GraphQL can't do it. And if craft.entries has a security flaw, then GraphQL has a security flaw. So any restrictions that craft.entries has, GraphQL has in that sense. On top of that, though, GraphQL has a token system. So the kind of standard way to interact with GraphQL is you send a bearer token, like a OAuth type header token, to say, this is who I am and this is who I'm authenticating as. And that token can have permissions with it within GraphQL. So you can say, I only want to open up access to the news channel. I don't want to open up access to the top secret projects channel. Just the news channel is the only thing I want to open up access to.
Right. Like, let's say I was publishing a blog and I wanted people to be able to syndicate it. I might open up to the world. You can read any of this blog stuff you want, but there are certain other private information that you would then only be able to get to if you had a token with the right permissions, right?
Exactly. And you can have as many tokens as you want. So one might be your public token that you're using on your website, and then another might be your Google Analytics token that's interacting with a service that's reading it, or might be interacting with your whatever else. You can have multiple tokens. Each one would have different.
Now, how do I actually keep this token private? If I have JavaScript on the front end that needs to somehow read and send this token, how do I keep this private?
So from the JavaScript on the front end, you can't. And you could obfuscate it as much as you want, and you could hide it as much as you want. But if it's in JavaScript, at some point, someone's going to be able to get to it.
Right. Security through obscurity doesn't work.
Yeah, but that's okay, because if you make a token that's locked down to only show news and it can't show anything else, then what they're getting through the token is no different than what they would have gotten through an Elements API endpoint, or no different than what they could have done if you left yourself open to like a URL injection type thing. So as long as your token's appropriately locked down, there's not really much a malicious person can do beyond what they could do through a template or through Elements API or something like that.
Now, is there a way to kind of correlate token permissions with actual user permissions that are in Craft. Like if I've got a user group called admin and I've got a porthole, or not admin, let's call it, editors. And I've got a portal that they can use that they can log in. Is there a way to kind of have that work automatically and they get the same permissions as they would in Craft on the back end, or?
So not yet. And I didn't architect GraphQL against the Craft user permissions intentionally because they just seem too different. So the Craft user permissions have a lot of, all of those little checkboxes in the user roles scene. It has a lot of checkboxes for things like, can they edit this? Can they view this? Can they change? And that's not necessarily the same as what you're looking at within the CraftQL or the GraphQL side of things. So honestly, the GraphQL permissions is probably a little more specific than the generic Craft, and it's tailored towards different things. So
it's resource specific, rather than user specific.
I think at some point probably. I do want to move. I want to get off of my kind of custom tokens and get back on the kind of Craft bandwagon, like native stuff. But when I was first diving into Craft 3, it didn't seem like it was the right place for it.
Well, and it's not a big deal also. Like if you have said portal, you could have something where it checks the user group and just returns the token that's appropriate for the permissions you want to give to that user group. So, whatever.
Well, and if you need true token authentication for your Craft site, there is a plugin for that.
Okay. Do you know who made it?
I do know who made it.
Who made it?
I do know who made it. Oh, I made it.
Oh, very nice. Excellent.
But no, when you're doing stuff with like the CraftQL tokens, you can sort of deal with that more like a public key, like a publishable key, because you're probably just giving access, using that token to restrict access so that only publishable public resources are available. And if you are giving somebody a more private token, then you are only giving it to them after they have authenticated with you some other way. In which case, as long as your transport is secure, like you're HTTPSing everything and you can't have a middleman snooping, then that token is pretty secure as well. I mean, that's true of any JavaScript system that needs to authenticate you with a token.
Right. Now, we've talked a lot about using GraphQL, and in the context of Craft, your GraphQL plugin to get data. But is changing data, is deleting stuff, is updating stuff, is that something that GraphQL can do too, Mark?
Yeah, so GraphQL, we've been talking about as a query language, but there's definitely a what GraphQL calls a mutation field or a mutation action, and you can use that to change data. And in theory, in like the spec version, the mutation can be used to do any sort of update, whether it's update, delete, edit, all of that would be called a mutation.
Mm-hmm.
Query can only return data in there. So yes, you can use mutations, and mutations work through the same sort of element API that you would use if you were writing a plugin in Craft and you were inserting data into Craft manually. So you can actually call upsert stories or upsert entries. Sorry, you can call upsert entries, and you can say, this is my title, this is my matrix block, and you can say the first block is this, the second block is this, the third block is this, and that will save into Craft just as if you had opened up Craft and typed it all out. But the really neat thing about Craft and GraphQL mutations is that a mutation is just a query that has a side effect. So when I run a mutation called upsert entries, you can't run a query that's just called query. You have to say query, and then you have to say what you want to get back. I want to get back an ID, a title, and the body field.
Right.
When you run a GraphQL mutation, you say, I want to insert this entry, and I want to set the title and the body to this. You also have to say, I want to get back the ID and the title, or the ID and the body, or you have to say what you want to get back, because mutations are essentially just queries. So what's neat is you can actually say, insert this new entry, and then give me back the ID and related entries to it. And the related entries can go both ways. You can say anything that's referencing me or anything I'm referencing, but it's really just a query in the mutation sense of things. So it's kind of a fun thing about GraphQL. And what I think a fun thing about GraphQL is you can just kind of blindly insert things into Craft real easily.
Assuming you have the right permissions.
Assuming you have the right permissions, definitely.
Jonathan is someone who has just dealt with something like this, right, Jonathan, where he had, we won't go into details, but you had a front-end entry form that apparently got hit?
Dear God, yeah. So it looks to be like somebody attempted. It was just a front end entry form, like you said, where somebody it's like a submit a question type thing. And so it looks like a fifth grader in their parents' basement tried to do a SQL injection attack for the entire month of February. So quite the cleanup operation.
Yeah, but so Mark, in hearing this, someone who has done kind of front end entry forms in Craft where people can submit data, even if it's something as simple as a contact form. But a lot of people have written much more complicated stuff where the user is able to manipulate some stuff on the front end that ends up with resulting matrix blocks and relations and all kind of stuff on the back end. You might say to yourself, well, why would I go through GraphQL to do this? Because I can already do this by hitting the right controller endpoints. And I guess my kind of answer to that would be the same reason you would use it for querying stuff, right? You've got a standard way that you can go through and do this. But what would your answer to that be? Like, why would I add this extra layer when I'm trying to save stuff from a front-end entry form?
So my answer would be similar to what we were saying before, is that you don't have to do all of that extra work of doing it yourself. So I was doing something recently in Craft where I wanted to allow users to essentially leave comments. And I made my comments as a channel in Craft. I wanted to allow them to save it. So I wired up a front-end entry form, and then I realized that I needed to adjust things a little bit before they actually got saved in the database. So I wired up my own plugin and wrote some custom logic it was so silly, but essentially append something to the end of one of the fields that I was inserting. And that was a custom plugin that I then had to maintain and support and blah, blah, blah. And it was mine. But it's something like GraphQL or CraftQL is you could do all of that in the JavaScript that chances are you're already writing anyway, because you're submitting these forms over Ajax anyway. So you can do that JavaScript in your Ajax form before it even gets submitted to GraphQL or CraftQL. GraphQL can then ingest that and give it back, the data that you need. So, I mean, the biggest reason to me is that it's just one less thing that you have to manage. It's just one less thing that you have to worry. And hopefully you just turn on GraphQL and hit it, and you don't have to worry, and then you're done. You don't have to write any custom code.
Well, the thing that scares me about this, and I would like you to kind of answer it, is I'm thinking about poor Jonathan. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about, if he had implemented this using a GraphQL API, some kid in his parents' basement could just write a JavaScript that, submitted a whole bunch of crap to the GraphQL endpoint and just spam the hell out of it, right? Or is there any kind of, what kind of validation, or is there any kind of interim step? Because, one of the things we're told from day one is never trust front-end validation for anything, right? We need back-end validate. You can do front-end validation, but that's really for the user to try and make it easy for them to enter stuff. But before you put anything in the database, you've got to make sure that it is sanitized and it's been validated before it goes in. So how does GraphQL and or CraftQL fit into that equation in terms of doing validation before it actually gets inserted in the database?
Sure, and I got two answers for you on that one, and both of them are GraphQL based. GraphQL actually doesn't do anything here because it doesn't have to. GraphQL handles all of this for you. The first thing it does is through the type system, so you don't have to. This is a horrible thing to say, and I'm going to regret it as soon as I say it. But you don't have to worry you don't have to worry about SQL injection with GraphQL. You absolutely do, but you don't have to as much, because when you're asking someone to input, a post title, you're asking for a post title string, and it's not quote mark the title quote mark. It's a string. It's a true string from end to end, and it can't be anything else. So you don't have to worry about the string ending halfway through and little Bobby tables getting into your database, because it's just a pure string. Or if you're asking for an entry ID, you don't have to worry about it being anything other than an integer, because it's not GraphQL, it's not Craft, it's GraphQL the spec won't allow anything in other than an integer. Or
what
other
about
than a
things
string.
like overflows, where people try to stuff a field with, you know, enough characters to do a buffer overflow and that type? Can you limit the length of things, for instance?
You can. I don't know that GraphQL would save you there, but actually Craft would probably save you there, because at least in terms of CraftQL, what we're doing is we're just using the standard Craft 3 API to save things. So
Right.
you'd probably be protected by Craft, but I'd have to look into that more. But I do think that in terms of safety, you're protected by at least some things that REST can't protect you by, just by the type system
Right.
Of GraphQL for sure. The other part, though, and this is where GraphQL makes things really hard. Like, GraphQL makes a lot of things really easy, but it makes some things really hard. The one thing it makes really hard is caching. Like, it's impossible to cache GraphQL because everything goes through the same endpoint. So everything is /API. So you can't just blindly throw varnish in front of it and say, job's done.
Right.
I'm going to support. Like, it's you have to worry about, like, how do I cache this? So that's something that GraphQL doesn't handle yet. I need to work on how do I implement caching smartly so that we're caching things appropriately per token, per user, per request. Like, that's a hard problem to solve in GraphQL that is relatively answered in REST. And then the same thing for validation. There is validation that you can put in place in GraphQL and in GraphQL, but it's not as easy and it's not as kind of documented and done as REST. So I do think that's an area that still needs some amount of thinking.
Now, is that an area where using something like Amazon's API gateway could save you, and you just say, okay, I'm going to implement the API there and let them deal with the caching side of things?
I'm not sure. Could you do it? Could you do it per token through the API? Yeah, I guess you could.
I've never done it. I'm just asking.
I don't know. I haven't tried it either. I feel like, yeah, it might be able to get you pretty far down that path, but I haven't tried it.
Well, in terms of caching, you just have to make sure that your cache is sensitive to what query parameters it are unique and which ones aren't, and make sure that it's like deduping, based on order and stuff. And there may or may not be a plugin coming for Craft 3 that helps with some of that. But the other thing about GraphQL is that it does let you do rate limiting and node limiting pretty easily. And I have not played with this on the mutation side, but a thing that you can build into your GraphQL server is like rate limits and how many requests a client can do in a given amount of time and how many nodes they can hit in a given amount of time. And I think there's even some notion, if I remember correctly, of like a cost for different requests. And so, if you are exposing some piece of your system where, not that somebody's going to hack you by exploiting this endpoint, but they could like dirty up your data or something, do something mildly malicious.
Yeah, cause Jonathan to lose a whole afternoon cleaning out the database.
Then you probably make that a really high cost request.
Right.
And in doing so, you effectively throttle it so that they can only cause you so much pain in so much time.
I think limiting the pain is where it's at.
Right. Like if I make it so that you can only submit one spammy thing, every 30 seconds, then
you're going to move on to something else.
Yeah,
you're going to go find the next guy.
And Jonathan,
hopefully I just make you give up and go pick on somebody else's server.
And Jonathan, you nailed it, because that's exactly the same motto you have as a parent, right? You're never going to eliminate pain, but you try and limit it, right?
That's exactly right. Yep.
It's all about pain mitigation. So the exciting thing to me about GraphQL is not just that it's an awesome new piece of technology, because I do think that is awesome, but using it with GraphQL, I don't have to learn whatever weird custom syntax there is for the element API. I don't have to learn whatever weird custom controller endpoints I have to hit to save front-end entry forms. It sounds like it's going to be easier for me to do this stuff if I have this GraphQL layer. Is that right, Mark?
I think it's 100% easier. And I think GraphQL has been around for a couple months now, probably maybe 3 months-ish or so. And the issues on the GraphQL GitHub repo, one of the things I really like about Craft 3 is the composer support and all the GitHub stuff that everyone's been doing. It's really nice to see. But the issues have been pretty active, and someone sent me an issue a while back, and I really enjoyed it because one of the things that GraphQL does is it exposes the GraphQL, the GraphIQL, the GraphIQL kind of IDE into GraphQL in Craft. So when you install GraphQL, in the sidebar of Craft, you get a little button that says GraphQL, and you click on it, and it gives you a split pane. And the left is, type in your query, and the right is look at your answers or look at the response.
It's like CodePen built into your CMS.
We should pause just to revere how absolutely stunningly awesome that is.
Yeah.
It's for dev and debugging, and like this is like godsend level feature right here.
And it's like, so GraphQL is modeled after craft.entries, and craft.entries is fantastic, but there's like every single day I find something new in craft.entries that I either been doing wrong or could have been doing differently. And the really cool thing about GraphQL and what GraphQL puts into your admin UI is you click it and you get autocomplete for everything. So as you're trying to learn your API, or as you're trying to learn, maybe you're a new dev who just got brought into the project, maybe you're just trying to visualize what it is you're building as you're building it, but you just start typing, entries, and then underneath it, you just start typing in the fields that you want to get back, and you hit return, and you get that response over on the right. So the cool thing that I heard in the GraphQL issues recently was someone is actually using this with their clients, because the client was looking for a way, how do I find all of the entries that I updated last month because I forgot to do this on them and I want to update them. So he taught them GraphQL, or he taught them GraphQL, so that they can just log in, click that button, they compose their query through the query language, which is relatively straightforward. It's still arcane and foreign and takes some learning, but with autocomplete, it gets a lot easier. So that client could then just log in, they type their query in, I want to find all my news that was from this date that has this field set to this, and they hit return, and they see the IDs of all of the fields that they want to edit over there on the right, and then they can just. So I've heard that a couple people are using this as a client-side tool to find data.
Now, it depends on the client. Depends on the client.
100%.
I was about to say, as awesome as I think that is, most of my clients, I don't want to let them anywhere near it. They're going to get scared.
Sure.
But
today we're going to learn GraphQL.
Yeah, but Mark, I got to be honest. Like that godlike halo that I had imagined around you, it just came down a peg or two. I thought you designed that whole UI that was in the Craft backend. You're saying
that is GraphQL. That is a well-documented IDE within the GraphQL community.
Oh my god!
I mean, I made the whole thing myself.
Yeah, that's better. Now I'm just gonna forget that I ever heard that wasn't you that designed that whole thing.
No,
because it's pretty spectacular.
Actually, Mark still has his halo from when I was able to upload a file in Expression Engine 2 just by choosing a selector.
And Mark, this is a slight detour, but we do have a user submitted question for you.
Oh no.
They want to know. They want to know when you're going to update MH file for Expression Engine.
Slated for E5.
All right. You heard it here first. MH file will be updated in EE5. All right. We got you on record. But yeah, I mean, getting back to what I was saying before, I mean, I've got lots of sites I work on where there are front-end entry forms, and GraphQL makes it easier for me to make this stuff. You know, whatever it is that, whatever user-generated content that I need to save, I don't have to go in and learn, how to ping this controller, how to ping that controller, what user controller I need to hit and what params need to be in there and all that kind of good stuff. I can just use the GraphQL API. And then when I want to get it back, I use the exact same API. I don't have to write my own element API PHP file and, narrowly specify what it's going to be. I just use the exact same API to get it back. I mean, it's just awesome in terms of how much quicker it makes to develop stuff like that. And that gets back to where we're talking about before. Okay, maybe you're working on a site where it doesn't make sense that you're going to publish your own API to be consumed. but maybe this is going to be easier for you because maybe you are saving, you're saving contact info data in a contact form or, some other kind of basic stuff. Mm-hmm. This lets you learn the standard that is GraphQL while at the same time being able to save all that stuff on the back end, which is pretty awesome. Yeah. This is where you're supposed to chime in and just sell the hell out of your plugin and how awesome it is. That was the setup. You hit it out of the park. Go ahead.
No, I completely agree. And I think, so the other thing though that I think is, I think GraphQL is still definitely in its infancy. And I think we're still trying to figure out a lot of things with GraphQL. One of the questions you asked earlier that I think is still really hard to answer is how do I use this thing? I think because it's really easy to say, well, you just make this query and you post it to the API endpoint and then it's done. But there's things like Relay, there's things like Apollo, there's all of this kind of tooling that's going around GraphQL, and there's Gatsby JS, and there's all of these tools that kind of like integrate with GraphQL that like no one, I don't think, has figured out. Everyone has different ideas of what GraphQL is, and right. I don't think that we've really figured out as a community or as a community kind of what this tool is and how we're going to use it. And eventually everyone will settle into like the niches of how it's used. But I do think it's early on in GraphQL. So I think it's also early on in CraftQL. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about it is that all of the places that we can go with this. So things like front-end entry forms really haven't gotten a lot of love in GraphQL, but I think it would be amazing to make them a first-class citizen in GraphQL.
Right.
Right now, we just really you can save data, but it's just kind of a CRUD. It's not like it's just raw saving, but it would be awesome if there was something in there that was specifically tailored towards, front-end saving of data. And that's something that some mutations are still kind of, in my opinion, evolving in GraphQL, and I think they're going to evolve in CraftQL as well. So it's an exciting time kind of for the module and for GraphQL as a language.
At the end of the day, GraphQL is basically a framework, right? It's in the way that Vue or React or any other library that you use is, right? It's like we are all doing this same thing over and over and over again, re-implementing the same generic functionality on every project. Surely there must be a way that we can generalize this and turn it into a standard of some sort. And that's kind of where we're at. GraphQL is kind of like the first answer to that problem that has sort of hit mainstream. And I fully expect that there will be, if not through the evolution of GraphQL, like some other similar looking spiritual successor, right, that answers this same problem. And I think that we'll see it evolve just like any other framework landscape evolves. And I'm pretty pumped for that.
And Mark, just to add to your to-do list, because I know that you've got just copious amounts of free time, you also need to write the adapter for Gatsby for Craft CMS so that we can use Craft as a data source to generate static sites from via Gatsby. So that's on your list, right?
It is. And so
is that before or after MH file?
No, that's after. MH file is always first priority.
Okay. All right. All right.
Gatsby's a really tough one. It's like a really interesting problem because the way Gatsby's written, and I put this in the Gatsby issue log on GitHub, and I feel a little bad about it, but the way I would describe Gatsby is it takes really bad APIs and turns them into a really nice GraphQL layer.
Right.
So like nobody wants to look at their file system and get contents out of a markdown files and turn those into pages. But Gatsby does that automatically for you because the source data is awful, but Gatsby turns it into really nice GraphQL that is nice.
Right.
It's really hard to take a really nice GraphQL layer and layer it into Gatsby because you essentially lose all of the GraphQL functionality by shoving it down into Gatsby's really limited system. That's all going to change in the next version of Gatsby, which is really exciting. Gatsby and GraphQL as a language are coming up with this idea of composition. So you can take, and this is gonna really blow GraphQL, everyone in GraphQL's minds, is you can take like GraphQL service A and GraphQL service B, and you can create GraphQL service C, which is a composition of A and B,
compose them
and compose them together so that you hit you hit C, but you can still access both A and B. And you run into namespace conflicts and all sorts of issues that are better figured out by people smarter than me. But the composition of GraphQL services, because you have the type system, because you have documentation, because you have this well-formatted system, you can do that. So the new version of Gatsby is going to use composition, which is really exciting because we could be able to use Gatsby to compose GraphQL into it and interact with Gatsby and GraphQL as if they're both first-class citizens.
Yeah, because that's what I want, man. I
the
want
next version of Gatsby, 100%. I'm totally on board.
Yeah, because then what we can do is we can use Gatsby to statically generate all of the content from Craft CMS or wherever the hell it is, and then using basically the kind of the same APIs or going through GraphQL anyway, we can then light it up dynamically by talking to the same server to get the same stuff. It would be freaking fantastic.
Agreed.
Wow, I almost got a strike mark for language there. I was very close. Oh, man. So I've got a completely self-serving question that I want to ask you, Mark. So I've got this little plugin called SEOmatic, right? And there's a version of it for Craft 3.
Is there a version of it for Craft 3?
There is.
Is it released yet?
It's at beta 19, and actually it's very, very close to going.
That doesn't count.
It's very close to going GA. Anyway,
it's a GA 19.
let me put it this way: it's closer than Charge is. Okay. Boom.
Ouch.
Boom.
Burn.
Nice.
That was a very legitimate, well-landed burn.
All right.
Touche, sir.
But in any event, since I'm very conscious of front end technologies, one of the things that is built and running Craft headless and all that stuff. One of the things that I built into it is you can ping a controller endpoint and it will return to you all of the metadata for a URI, right? So if you're using Vue on the front end or React on the front end and Craft is headless, using Vue or React or whatever it is you're using on the front end, you can say, hey, Craft, give me all the metadata for this particular thing. And they're all broken down by containers. So the meta tags will be in a separate container from the scripts, blah, blah, blah. So then you can just insert them in the DOM and go on your merry way. And then everyone's happy. Does it make sense? Is there any way that I can interface with GraphQL, if it's installed, to allow people to then kind of query me for that? And does that even make sense to do something like that?
So selfishly, I think it completely makes sense to do that. I think it's a great idea.
Right.
But no, so it is possible, absolutely. The nice thing about Craft 3 that I've been getting used to is the event system in Ye2. So there's an event that fires when GraphQL builds its schema, and it's called get field schema. And that event is fired for every field or every kind of piece of an entry or a piece of Craft. So you could hook into that event, and then you would essentially add to the schema however you like. One of the things that I did early on in GraphQL that is paying dividends now, and I'm happy about, is I built a query builder, not a query builder, but a schema builder layer on top of GraphQL. So you could definitely do what you're describing, and you could do it without even really knowing GraphQL. You could say, I'm going to listen to this event. Inside the event, you're past the schema, and you could say schema.add string field. And then you would say string field arrow lists if it's a list of things, or string field non-null if it can't be null or something like that. So the cool thing about GraphQL being typed is it makes that sort of stuff really easy, because you kind of know what everything is going to give back. There's no ambiguity in the schema, but it means that the code that you write to implement the schema is also known. So if you're using PHP Storm or something like that, you can just do schema arrow, add new string field, and it'll autocomplete it and kind of tell you everything on there. And then on the string field, you can do everything you need. So you could absolutely do it. GraphQL implements already with things like the redactor field. I forget the name of the markdown field, Doxter, Simple Map. Like, there's a number of plugins that people have submitted to the GraphQL issue queue that I've been able to implement.
But this is something I can add myself without ever bothering you, right?
You could add yourself without ever bothering you. If enough people submit it to the GraphQL, what I would probably do personally is I'd reach out and say, do you want to add this? And you would say, no, I don't have time for you. And I would say, would you mind if I implemented it myself into the GraphQL schema? Because so you could add it in either place.
Right.
But yeah, you could absolutely add it if you were so inclined.
You're in trouble now, because now I'm going to harass you about this, because I'm thinking about it from the point of view that, okay, if I'm writing this awesome front end in Vue and it's consuming everything from Craft CMS via GraphQL, courtesy of GraphQL, why am I hitting a controller endpoint to get the meta container stuff? Why can't I just use GraphQL via GraphQL to just grab this stuff for me? And it just kind of makes sense, right?
Completely agree. And
I'll harass you about that offline. I don't want to bore everyone with my own personal issues, but it sounds exciting to me. And
yeah,
if I had to summarize this, I think that honestly, I think that Pixel and Tonic should just buy this plugin and give you millions and millions of dollars, because this is the kind of defined API that Craft really needs. I mean, it really is. And yeah, they can do it via REST, and I know that REST is fine, but I'm really interested in the way that that GraphQL works and kind of bolts it on. So I hope that the next time I talk to you, you're on some island somewhere with the millions that you've been bought out. But yeah. I would love
hold out for at least $1 million. At least.
Yeah, well, I'll help you negotiate if it comes up.
I'm requiring they buy MHFile though if they do it.
Fair enough.
I don't want that anymore.
Fair enough. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just fantastic from the point of view of learning GraphQL now, because a lot of the APIs you're going to be consuming are very likely going to be coming in via GraphQL. And then also learning it just because when you're working with Craft, it's going to make a whole lot of things a lot easier, especially when we start buying into the JAMstack part of things a little bit more and we want to use Craft headless. But even if we don't want to do that, even if we just have user-submitted data that we want to be able to save easily to the back end, I love the idea of learning a standard to do something rather than learning someone's kind of boutique API to do something, And I love the idea that, in theory, the way that I'm doing saving these entries via GraphQL via Craft, in theory, some other CMS comes along, I could do the same exact thing, as long as there's that kind of layer there to do it. So, I mean, that's what I'm excited about. Marion, what do you look super excited now? You're not looking disdainfully at us now. What are you excited about from all this?
I was wondering the same thing that you were sort of asking about, all of us plugin developers and what opportunities do we have to hop on board with our plugins?
Well, there you go. Now Marion's going to harass you too, Mark.
Yeah, well, I'm
okay.
I do not have SEO-matic, but I have a couple of tiny little field types and things like that. Do they need to, or can they participate in this? Do they need to participate in this?
Can we have a GraphQL perversion? Are you going to make it do things it shouldn't do, Marion?
No. I veto that idea.
I personally like writing my JSON and Twig, but
Michael, what about you, man? Give us your summary. We know you're getting to the bottom of your computer science credentials, and you got to get out of here. So tell us your summary.
I think I'm excited for GraphQL, not just because of GraphQL, but because like the next 6 to 12 months of the evolution of like GraphQL as an answer to this problem, I think is going to be really interesting. And I think learning GraphQL is a good move right now, because whatever the next step is in our industry, it may not be GraphQL. It may very likely be some evolution of GraphQL, but it may be something else, but it will look like GraphQL, and it will like have that philosophy behind it. And so I think like both as a consumer and as a distributor of content on the web, I think getting into this mindset is going to lead you good places in terms of dev skills and solutions that you can offer to your customers.
How about you, Jonathan? What are you taking from all this? Anything interesting?
Yeah, I mean, just the idea that it would be an interesting time to to start. If you're not on board with this, it's so easy to play with it now. I mean, install GraphQL. Like, this gives you an out of the box solution to start playing with it.
It's that UI that Mark developed from scratch that lets you do all this. It's amazing.
Yeah. Completely from scratch. Amazing. All the time he put into doing that for us. So I mean, this does seem to be the direction things are taking. So if nothing else, it's an easy little sandbox playground for yourself to sort of experiment with it. But hopefully you'll do more useful things with it too.
So Mark, you're the resident expert here, and obviously, I mean, I personally think that your GraphQL plugin is fantastic. But why don't you, if you're any kind of thing you want to summarize or wrap up the conversation, we're kind of coming to an end here. But if you have any, thoughts or motivations to get people on board to giving this a shot.
So I think Jonathan's speech was the best. I think the greatest thing about GraphQL is you just put it on any site that you're already running and just go to town and play with it.
Right.
I think there's a lot of really fun things that you can kind of explore through the GraphQL system, and the type ahead makes it really easy to just explore. And it kind of makes APIs really fun to just look into instead of a chore to look up and document and figure out where everything is. So it's a fun thing that you can just install just to play with and see if it works for you. I would also say that the GraphQL GitHub issues are pretty active. They're nicely active. There's a lot of people in there. So definitely, if you're listening or if you're experimenting with it, don't shy away from opening tickets. I love just responding to them, even if it's a won't fix or a, coming in the next feature. But it's fun to just get that feedback. So the issue board's a good place to be too.
Yeah, and just to kind of dovetail off of what you were mentioning, the interface that you get after you install GraphQL, it's kind of like having CodePen just sitting in your admin CP, where you can just experiment with stuff and play around with it and see the results, and it's really cool, and you're not going to hurt anything, So I think that is a great way to get started with it, is just load it in there and kind of play around with it. And my kind of final thoughts on this are to mention something that Michael kind of touched on, where I think that it's incredibly valuable that you are learning something like GraphQL, because whatever the next thing is, whatever the next CMS is, like whatever the next technology is, you're learning a neutral API that in one form or another is going to be around and is going to be valuable, as opposed to learning, a kind of boutique API. And, we're kind of teasing Mark about his MH file plugin, but just think of all the hours invested in learning, all the parsing order in EE and all of the peculiarities there, and how that, and I'm not picking on EE. This goes with any kind of, custom technology. And think about how much better spent it would be if it was something that had a little bit longer legs and was kind of a layer in between things, the way that that GraphQL is. So
standards are good.
Yeah.
When the standards are good, then standards are good.
Yeah, and that goes with anything, whether, and that's another reason why I love Vue, or I like it better than React, to be honest with you. But React and Vue are both really, really useful because they are a standard with a huge community around them, rather than Joe Bob's custom JavaScript that happens to do something. And I love that. Learning GraphQL is something that is very likely going to be a valuable skill, whether you're using Craft CMS, whether you're doing JAMstack stuff, whether you're consuming APIs. It just seems like its nature as this kind of layer in between things makes it kind of certain that it's going to be around a lot longer than a lot of other things, I think.
When you have good frameworks and good standards, they sort of set the new baseline, right? It's like, I don't have to write my auth controller anymore, like my username password controller, and have to worry about all the different ways that somebody might break my authentication endpoint or try to hack me.
Or is it camel case? Is it snake case? Is it kebab case?
Because those best practices are already built in to the authentication endpoint in Laravel or Yi or whatever my framework is, right? So that's just, it's a new baseline for me, and I get to start further down the field because a bunch of that best practice work is already done for me, and so it frees up my bandwidth to focus on things that are specific to my domain or things that I can do to, innovate further rather than having to go back and re-implement the same wheel over and over again. And it's the same with GraphQL.
Yeah, and I think your skills are more
pushes us forward,
and not just pushes us forward, but your skills are more portable. Again, I can do the same thing for Craft, and I can do it for WordPress even, and a number of other systems that are having GraphQL layers built on them, Laravel, whatever it is, whatever it is.
Enact CMS.
Enact CMS is a big one. That's going to be huge. Anyway, I think this has been an awesome discussion. We went on for a long time. I could go on for a lot longer. And Mark, I hope we have you on again. And I absolutely am going to be harassing you about the whole SEO-matic thing. But that wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS feed or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a review. Makes a big difference. And it's going to make it more likely that we're going to be around. Okay. You can also follow us on Twitter at devModeFM. And we'd love to hear your thoughts about this episode. Just leave us a comment on the devMode.fm website. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Marion Newlevant.
I'm Michael Rogg.
I'm Jonathan Melville.
And our special guest, Mark Huot.
Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you coming on here, and bye-bye.
All right. See y'all later.